We have 4 panelists today. I'm very excited to share with you. They are Parijat Chakrabarti, Imane Bello, Andreas Holzinger, and Philip Kabuya. So each panelist is going to share with you their key points as an introduction. We'll give them about 5 minutes, and then we'll have some discussion, some questions for each other. If at any point a question occurs to you, please put your question into the Zoom chat. We won't probably get to all of them, but we will definitely try. So to start us off, Parijat, would you turn your camera on and join me here? Parijat is joining us from the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. Hi there, nice to see you.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay,
so,
great.
Would you now share with us your key points, and be sure to start with a brief self-description?
Sure. So hi, everyone. I'm Parijat. For the visually impaired, I'm a brown man with a buzz cut and wearing a white shirt. I'm a sociologist by training, and I'm currently a postdoctoral fellow, as are mentioned, at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. And before coming here, I spent the last 2.5 years in Nairobi, Kenya, conducting research at the intersection of sustainable development, technology, and finance. And for those who don't know, Nairobi is one of the largest tech hubs in Africa, and sometimes called Silicon Savannah. And it's a hotbed for technology-driven market experiments, typically financial inclusion initiatives intended to promote development. And in addition to my research, I advised or consulted on a number of related tech, finance, and agriculture development projects in Kenya and in Ethiopia. So for this panel, I have 2 key points that I want to communicate, and I'll develop those points by connecting it to my own experience of research and development work in East Africa. So first, given the hype and the rapid take-up of AI, we run the risk of having a solution in search of a problem instead of starting with the problem and then identifying appropriate solutions which may or may not include AI. And there's a saying which, if the only tool you have is a hammer, you tend to see every problem as a nail. So in cases where AI is maybe an ineffective tool to address a given problem, we would run the risk of wasting resources at best or creating unintended and sometimes undesirable consequences. So let me give an example of this. So over the course of my research, I worked with an ag tech platform that wanted to link small farmers and small scale traders across the fresh produce supply chain in Kenya. And using data generated by transactions on their platform, they intended to partner with financiers to offer credit, insurance, and other forms of financing to their users. And this is paradigmatic of financial inclusion, where the central idea is that access to financing can alleviate poverty. So a problem that the platform quickly encountered was that small-scale farmers and traders had non-standard produce, would typically negotiate on price, and would often not respect advanced contracts or would side sell, all of which made data collection and algorithmic management at scale incredibly difficult. So partly under investor pressure, the platform pivoted to focusing on large-scale industrial farmers and supermarkets or wholesalers who did have standardized growing methods and produce, standardized prices, and worked well with advanced contracts. So in this case, benefits ultimately accrued to large-scale farmers, wholesalers, and supermarkets, and not the small farmers and traders the platform initially intended to help. And so this is an example of how leading with the solution, in this case, AI-driven financial inclusion, can create unintended and possibly undesirable consequences, or that subverted, in this case, the initial goal of the platform. And so my second point, which is kind of related to the first, is that and this links to the example I just gave, is that how AI systems are designed and how they evolve are heavily dependent on the motivations of investors or funders. So for example, just before the pandemic, Kenya was dealing with digital lenders who aggressively pushed microloans and used aggressive debt collection tactics as a number of their investors were looking to quickly recoup their investment. And in a different sector, platforms with AI recommendation systems for best agricultural practices as they search for additional revenue partnered with crop insurance firms and major agrochemical distributors and pushed certain products as a solution for a given problem. So in each of the examples given, outcomes are less about the AI itself as a technology and more about the business models backing it. So to bring the discussion just back to civil society organizations, I think kind of to summarize, I would say there's 2 points. So one, we should be cautious about how we adopt AI. We should ask, does a particular problem really need an AI-based solution, or can it be addressed more effectively with other methods? And second, if indeed many problems with the AI system arise from kind of the funding models or investor pressure, we might consider how CSOs could help cultivate alternative models. And these might include, for example, worker-owned platforms, and there are many such kind of what they call platform cooperatives or alternative funding ecosystems that prioritize attachment to place and people as core values. I'll leave it there for now and looking forward to the discussion afterwards.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Parajat. You can turn off your camera for now. And I will ask Imane, coming to us from Paris, to turn on your camera. There you are. You can unmute yourself. You are fantastic. And would you take a few minutes to share us about the work you're doing and your thoughts on this topic?
Of course, thank you for having me. So for our visually impaired members, I am a Black woman and I'm wearing huge black glasses on my face. So I'm an expert in AI law and policy. I have a background as a lawyer in human and digital rights, business ethics, and tech law. And I have to say, I completely agree with what Parajat just shared with us in terms of how it is best for all actors, NGO included, obviously, to avoid technological solutionism. So thinking that AI systems or any tech-related solution might be or has to be the solution to a given problem, but rather always take a step back and ask whether or not this is the right road that we wish to walk upon. I see when it comes to the theme of AI and poverty, there's a lot we could discuss, obviously, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion. The two main issues that I think about when I hear this theme, I would say, is information poverty and access to information and access to opportunities related to AI systems, because we've seen numerously, and we have so many examples about the fact that due to the newest AI systems that are related to content generation, whether it's generating text, generating videos, generating images, there is so much more content that is being generated, sometimes without any regard to factual truth. And therefore, there is a high risk in terms of access to information. How reliable is our information when we live in a world where AI systems have tripled, if not more, the possibility to generate content without any regard to whether or not that content is in fact reliable. The second avenue, or the second issues that we could also discuss related to AI and poverty, are, well, the harms and the opportunities that are related to AI systems when it comes to uplifting social conditions. We usually say that there are two types of harms that are related to AI systems. There are harms of access, not having the possibility to access a loan, a certain degree, or certain information, a certain diploma, whatsoever. And then access of representation, being represented as non-human, despite being human, being represented as less than the human dignity that we all deserve to see recognized. And so for those particular harms, I always think about the work of Virginia Eubanks, who wrote this amazing book called Automating Inequality, where we have a lot of examples about how AI systems can be used and have been used towards marginalized communities, and had poor performances where where they would further impact marginalized families. One example that I could give you is the use by the Dutch government of a algorithm that was allegedly supposed to profile people in given risk categories to detect frauds, to detect social benefit frauds. And the Dutch courts ended up saying that that use was discriminatory because well, marginalized families and people having dual nationalities were adversely impacted by those systems who did not work the way they were supposed to. So there's just one example out of the ocean of examples that we have where AI systems are being deployed in context where instead of providing further opportunities, they in fact further marginalized communities. So, and I do think, and that would be my final point, that the upcoming AI policy and existing as well AI regulations provide a great framework for that, for all actors, NGOs included, to navigate the risks that are really not to be ignored and to be taken into account, while also providing opportunities for actually harnessing AI systems against poverty.
Thank you, Imani. We will come back to you in the discussion time. And now I'm going to invite Andreas to turn on your camera and unmute yourself and share your key points with us. And please don't forget to start with a brief description.
Thanks so much, much appreciated, and very interesting interventions already. For accessibility, I'm presenting as a white male wearing black glasses and a button-down shirt. And I've worked at the intersection of innovation, governance, and sustainability for a few years, and currently with the US Policy and Research Nonprofit Innovations for Poverty Action. I'd also like to add 2 points to what has been discussed, especially when it comes to access, the digital divide and access gaps. And the first one is that any potential for efficiency gains will be demanded. And this is from different actors, be it from taxpayers, from development partners, or from citizens in general, when it comes to better allocating the scarce resources that we have to tackle multidimensional poverty. So third and public sector actors will remain, and increasingly so, be under competitive pressure to make sure that they are delivering the best outcome possible for the least cost that is associated with this solution. So my first point is really to think about digital public infrastructures and how actors can push forward when it comes to AI systems integration and poverty reduction. And the example that I would like to draw on is a partnership that we were very lucky to have in Togo with the Ministry of Digital Economy and Transformation, where early on in the pandemic with the Novisi project, they decided in collaboration with some university professors and us to think through how we can better target households that are in dire need for social protection assistance. In a time where, of course, during the pandemic, there were a lot of barriers that we didn't experience before. And so a combination between machine learning, geospatial, and cell phone data allowed us to predict the households that are in need for the social protection schemes right away. And this enabled us to look at a territory of over 8 million people, and nearly 70% of them could be predicted, and thus new households were identified as beneficiaries for these social protection schemes. So I think this really helped us in going a next step towards creating an interoperable social protection system that accelerates digital inclusion. The second example that I would like to mention is also related to what Ima has said before, in terms of creating access bridge builders, let's say, like the researchers in the last example. We can also think about this in the NGO world a bit more specifically. As Parijat mentioned, we don't want to heighten inequity by increasing the access gap. We don't want rural people or socioeconomically disadvantaged people to suffer from information poverty, increase the digital divide, but rather we want to think through inclusivity and data privacy, especially in fragile institutional settings. And so one area, for instance, as you mentioned, health as an area, Barb, in the beginning, that we could think through is when it comes to AI-assisted health support infrastructures, you utilize what is already in place, like community health workers, and make sure that they are the bridge builders to facilitate that gap between how to use AI properly and how people can benefit from it best. Maybe the other point I would also delegate to the discussion when it comes to the lack of oversight on AI systems. And here I think regulatory creativity is needed. I'd end this short intervention maybe with one call for action for my fellow NGO colleagues. And it's really to think through how to deal with this competitive pressure that you will sense and you will be under, and agreeing that you shouldn't just think AI as the solution, but if you think that there's a problem that can be improved with certain data science or other efforts that are related to generative AI or other parts of our discussion, then test it within the realms of data privacy and other ethical and legal implications, of course, but test to see what is working, what isn't working, so that when the time comes and you're asked to really think through how to better allocate your resources from your funders or from your partners or the government, that you already have answers at hand to see how you can best invest those for the people and communities you aim to serve. Thanks so much.
Andreas, thank you so much. I want to mention that he is coming to us from Mexico City today. So you can turn your camera off. And our fourth panelist, Philip, would you turn your camera on? There you are. And so you are the last one to present in this round in the introduction phase. So you've got some time, and would you share your key points with us and your brief self-description?
All right.
Oh, and I also wanted to mention you're coming to us from Uganda. Sorry about that. Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah, couldn't forget my origin. So hello everyone. My name is Philip Kabuye. I work as the policy advisor Dictionary and Space with Oxfam Novib. I'm based in Uganda. I'm glad to be sharing on today's digital dialogue, and I'm a Black man with black hair. Obviously the hair is way darker than my skin tone, and I'm putting on a light green shirt for today. So AI and poverty, has everything been said? I want to reflect together on poverty in terms of exclusion. And here I want us to look at the multidimensional nature of poverty that extends beyond just the income or material deprivation. This encompasses the exclusion of individuals or groups from the various aspects of society, which can perpetuate their poverty. This concept really looks at poverty, not solely about lacking financial resources, but also about being marginalized or excluded from opportunities, resources, participation, and more. And some of the interesting dimensions to look at this would be around the social aspects. As we know, social exclusion will involve being excluded from participating in various social engagements due to factors like race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, disability, and many more. But as we know, this then limits access to networks and opportunities that can help individuals to escape poverty. When we look at the political aspect of it, it manifests when marginalized groups lack representation and participation in political processes and decision-making. And that way, then we have policies that do not adequately address the needs of the poor and the excluded. From the digital perspective, exclusion from these technologies and the internet can further isolate individuals and limit their access to information, to education, to job opportunities, and more. But if we try to look at the intersection of artificial intelligence and human dignity, it's quite complex and a bit ethical. Because human dignity is a fundamental concept in ethics and human rights, and it pertains to the inherent worth and value of every individual. So when considering AI, I think several aspects of dignity come into play. Aspects like privacy, autonomy. AI systems often process a lot of personal data, and this raises concerns about the privacy of people. And if we talk about respecting human dignity, it means respecting an individual's right to control their personal information and make autonomous decisions about its use. So when we look at frameworks like the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulations in Europe, it ensures that individuals have control over their personal data and that it is only used with their informed consent. So when we throw some light into the writings of Professor Shoshana Zuboff, in a book on the age of surveillance capitalism, Shoshana stresses the importance of being alert and concerned about data agreements, privacy agreements, especially those that openly declare that your data will be shared by third parties. But of course, they never disclose which third parties and for what purpose. And in most cases, not accepting these policies denies the use of that particular service. So therefore, we have to look at designing AI systems for social good, but with privacy and autonomy considered as essential factors. The Digital Services Act in Europe, that will soon, I think, get started implemented, has recognized the importance of these factors and has emphasized the need for AI systems to be transparent, accountable, and respect rights of individuals, which is a plus. And if we look at discrimination, we see algorithms that inherit biases from the data that they are trained on, which leads to discriminatory outcomes. And we continue to see substantial threats on social platforms, perpetuating biases and reinforcing societal divisions. Issues like hate speech, the xenophobic rhetorics, and the systematic divisions are being amplified through these platforms with the help of the algorithms. And they translate into demeaning actions offline, which widen the divisions and more. So if these biases are not addressed, AI can further exacerbate the existing inequalities and contribute to the persistence of poverty. We want to ensure transparency, and we want these systems to be transparent and accountable because it is essential in upholding human dignity. When decisions that are affecting us are made by opaque algorithms, it can undermine our dignity, and it denies us the ability to understand, to change, to appeal, to these decisions. We have seen Amazon, for example, going against the DSA. We've seen ChatGPT going hard on the European Commission around the EU AI Act, and definitely trying not to be regulated. And for me, the question is, if as we build our AI systems, we are ensuring transparency and willing to be accountable, then why fear the regulation? Safety is very key in implementation, because cybersecurity is all involved, and ensuring that these AI systems are reliable and secure is essential to protect human dignity. We see facial recognition systems gaining traction in China today, and soon it will spread across other countries. And as we know, authoritarian regimes could do anything to track down those that speak to dissent. So how safe are they or their families with all cities installed with cameras, So such brilliant systems do not only pose a threat to rights defenders, but also communities facing discrimination. My colleagues have been talking about access and equality. So if we lack access to these advancements, it undermines the dignity of the marginalized or the disadvantaged groups. And still around here, I would want to look at what we access, the information we consume, and how the algorithms feed us what they want, but not what we want. Many times we are simply talking about coffee and we start getting adverts when browsing, pushing us to get a discount in a coffee shop somewhere. And again, Zuboff calls that micro-targeting, but coupled with behavior surplus. So the algorithms are able to predict our moods with behavior surplus, listen to our conversations with micro-targeting, and use this data to the gains of these big tech companies. So therefore, the integration of AI into various aspects of society, including workplaces, education, healthcare, and more, raises questions about how AI and humans interact. Designing systems that respect and enhance human dignity in this collaboration is a significant ethical consideration. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Philip. You can leave your camera on, and I will invite Parajat Ima and Andreas to rejoin us here with your cameras on. Give Ima a moment. Great to see all of you back. This is the time in our dialogue where the presenters have a chance to ask each other questions. I think there's been not only overlap, but also a lot of similar thinking and challenges on this topic. So I'm going to come over to Parijat first and give you space to ask questions of any of your other panelists. You can unmute yourself. There you
Sure,
go.
great, thank you. Yeah, no, and thanks to everyone for who presented too. Is really interesting. Let's start with a quick question, I think, to Andreas. I think so. I fully agree with kind of your points, and I think that there is a question, and I think the question of how to best allocate resources effectively, I think, is kind of very much a key consideration and a driver for why I think organizations are interested in adopting AI systems. And I think you mentioned that digital public infrastructure is also, a key point that you were sort of pushing on. And I was kind of curious if about public-private partnerships, because often, at least from what I've seen, that it's not always the case that governments have the capacity or data necessarily to actually use AI systems effectively, and often they then rely on private partners to kind of implement that. And I was kind of curious if you had seen any of that in your work, and if you just could maybe reflect on that for what that means for like digital public infrastructure.
Yeah, thanks so much, Parijat. Very true. I feel like we know that most of money to AI development goes to commercial use, and that's deriving maybe from the global north and VC firms. And public-private partnerships is a lever that I think is underexplored. So maybe just going to the first example that I mentioned, at least there was a collaboration. So in Togo, the minister had a lot of expertise from the private sector. And of course, here we needed cell phone data and records. And so the negotiation was actually done by her and her team with the telco companies to make sure that we can exploit their data while making sure that, of course, we're compliant with all personally identifiable information that we certainly don't want to have leaked. So I think you're very right that it's something that hasn't been done very well, but I think for NGOs on the call and for actors in general, it's something that you can exploit more, and we can and should do, thinking about what strength each actor has. And sometimes if you have high-level government people being very much in favor of the initiatives that you're putting forth, having that negotiation power with the companies helps a lot. But yeah, I think when it comes to the risk, it's always, of course, as you also implied, crucial to make sure that you don't compromise compliance with the data privacy laws in country or globally, or even with the private sector actors. So yeah, thanks so much for asking.
Great.
What do you think? If I can play.
Yeah, no, I think
Yeah.
I agree that I think it's a thorny area, because often if the data, for example, is being held by private sector organizations or very large private sector organizations, and it is sort of, if the government, and if this is absolutely necessary data for, say, basic government functioning, that can put the public at risk for, essentially being kind of having to, being beholden to private interests. That said, I think this is sort of a question of how to organize those kinds of partnerships or those relationships so that it actually does work for people. And I think that's a very open question. And yeah, I don't know the answer to that, but I'm curious to get people's thoughts. Yeah.
Thanks to both of you. As a reminder to the audience, you're very welcome to put questions into the chat. You're also welcome to just sit back and listen. Either way works. I actually have a question myself for Philip, especially as I was listening to you talk about using AI systems to be designed for good. And my question is, how do you motivate companies to do that so that they are interested? Because especially talking about accessibility for people who are living in poverty, what's the motivation that they have to do this? Have you seen solutions for that? What would you say to that question?
All right, so I do think the discussion is not around motivation. It's not more on motivation because, as we see, our goal is different. Our goal, for example, as civil society organizations, is to ensure that people are living a life of dignity, in whatever we do. So that comes with poverty alleviation and everything. And their goal is to maximize profits. So while we are trying to work hard towards ensuring people are having enjoying their fundamental freedoms, and people have all aspects that give them a life of dignity, it doesn't seem to be a concern of the big tech companies. That's why they build algorithms that they build learning models that want to understand our behavior, that want to know how we feel at what time, or what we do when, how do we drive the speed at which you go, and all those. And they use all this data to inform their marketing plans. They have built big business frameworks, online frameworks, and as Bob, who has a business, for example, that sells shoes, you will feed their systems with your business and the kind of customers you want. They will invest into the micro-targeting, into the social listening, and get to understand what you want when. And this is what Zuboff talks more about in behavior surplus. They understand your behavior. This is what the algorithms do. And they use this to push you towards Bab's shoe place, so that you can go and spend on a shoe, whether you need it or not. But they are manipulating your decisions with AI. So motivating them is hard. What we can do is always, I think, keep open about this kind of injustices, I should say, that keep manifesting in their design of the systems, and expose these and try to push back always. When we support adoption of laws like the Digital Services Act law, the EU AI Act law, that encourage regulation and ensuring transparency and accountability, then that's the best so far we can do as organizations. But also ensure that, for example, we're talking about laws happening in Europe, but what is happening in the US, what is happening in the global south, I should say, for many living in the authoritarian regimes, such laws that protect people are not welcome. They would rather copycat laws that try to infringe on the rights of the people.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, so definitely not easy. That's what I'm hearing, and I appreciate that. Sorry?
I have a question for everyone that kind of maybe builds on that, because I think a number of the points that people had already brought up were kind of risks of exclusion or kind of improper design. For example, if you put biased data in, you might get biased data out, or kind of the lack of recourse when it comes to algorithmic management. And I think often the solution we get is kind of appropriate regulation and appropriate design of AI systems. But I guess my question is, if we are operating in an environment with an authoritarian regime, or if you're operating in an environment where there isn't sufficient legal capacity to regulate those kinds of systems, then what do we do? And I think might be particularly relevant in as in some of the cases that Philip was mentioning.
Yeah, maybe to say something to what you're reflecting on, Pariat. I think last month there was a campaign by, is it DSL, to try and it was stop paying for hate or something like that, and a lot of it was targeted towards Twitter, because, as you know, recently they've started paying, I know, giving out handouts to accounts that are really gaining lots of impressions and everything, and you're paid accordingly, in total disregard of what the account is doing. So hate speech accounts that were getting incentivized to try and keep promoting their hate speech, there's xenophobic rhetorics are just getting rewarded. So I was just throwing light to that campaign, that such campaigns are really necessary, and because they also try to bring back sanity. One of the other campaigns that I could throw light to, if you recall, some years back during the Black Lives Matter protest, when there was a popular "you loot, we shoot" phrase from President Donald Trump, there was a public request for big social media platforms to put down this post. And for whoever took long, we saw big companies like Coca-Cola and the likes taking down their advertising from these platforms, which led to loss of billions for these companies. So such campaigns still remain relevant, they still remain vital, and I think can be a good force towards motivating these companies to build the aspect of human dignity in these systems.
Okay,
Great.
thank you, Philip. Yeah, Andreas, please go ahead.
Thanks, Barb. I was just actually thinking when we talk about supply chains, I think then of course those rules should apply anywhere, especially also in fragile institutional settings. But Ima, I think with your expertise, if you don't mind me playing the ball back to you, I'd be curious to hear about your experience when it comes to mechanisms and tech policy spaces that were established to better mitigate risks of AI systems. Maybe you can speak to that a bit.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for asking. I think so. You know, we talked a lot about assessing risk and ensuring that the adverse impacts of AI systems on marginalized communities are not further expanded, whether it's lack of inclusion or improper design, as Parvijat was just mentioning. But I do think we have lots of existing and upcoming regulations that exactly provide a really good framework to avoid those risks. One example that comes to mind when I was referring to earlier to information poverty. So not having access to proper information or proper educations or reliable information whatsoever is Article 52 of the European AI Act. Article 52 of the European AI Act, which is obviously currently draft, but that has already been accepted as an industry best practice and as an industry standard, so which is already applied by stakeholders, says this. It says, no matter who we are discussing, any person that is interacting with an AI system should know that they are indeed interacting with an AI system, whether it's a chatbot or a model based on a large language model or any other type of AI generated interaction between human and machines. I think that matters because if there are clear disclaimers whenever people are interacting with AI systems, if it is clear that a given text was AI generated, a given video was AI generated or created with AI systems, I think it would help people realize how much AI generated content is out there, and also interrogate for themselves whether the information they are getting is reliable. So that particular transparency mechanism that is already adopted as a best practice, and that is part of the European AI Act, and I don't think it will disappear from the act when it is enacted, helps and is a really good example of a regulatory mechanism that helps mitigate those risks. And that's just one example out of many other transparency requirements, information requirements, data quality management as well, requirements that would work in favor of mitigating those risks so that we can actually leverage the opportunities provided by our systems.
And Ima, can I ask you, because it's also part of the question that's coming from Lars, and that is, we can talk about regulation, and then we can talk about enforcement of regulation, and whether or not those things like the article that you just mentioned, which to me would be a game changer, because I think there's a lot of people who have no idea that they have already been interacting with AI. They think of AI as some sort of robot that they would see and recognize as such, instead of recognizing that it's data collection and that it's maybe a chatbot or something, but they're just not aware. And so that labeling, that transparency of, okay, you're interacting with AI at this moment, is that being enforced, and how is it being enforced?
So it's right now it's a soft law / policy requirement. It's been adopted by the bodies that create what is considered as the best practices in the industry, but it is also part of the European AI Act. So as soon as the AI Act enters into force, we still have to wait for a little bit for that to happen. As soon as the Act, enters into force, it should be respected. Now, in terms of enforcement, to answer your questions, the Act does provide for multiple different enforcement mechanisms, whether it's for national European authorities that can provide sanctions, give out sanctions to actors that are not in compliance with the Act, whether it's in forms of administrative penalties or other types of forms. But we also have, as Philippe was earlier mentioning, it's not an enforcement mechanism per se, but we also have reputational risks that are related to those type of either compliance breaches or behaviors in general. And here I think it would, another great example, and it's going to be my last point, but another great example here I think would be the Italian decisions. So the Italian National Data Protection Authority did sanction this year, early this year in February, then March, then April, the authority provided sanctions towards ChatGPT, and those sanctions forced the provider of ChatGPT to change some, key transparency requirements and key policy or information that were given to consumers. So we already have some avenues or some mechanisms where it's unclear whether or not an information is properly given to consumers, whether it's unclear if people actually understand that they are interacting with an AI system, whether that AI system may have discriminatory outcomes or not. We already have those mechanisms in place, as Philippe was mentioning earlier, notably through the GDPR.
Yeah, thank you for that. Parjat, you've unmuted yourself. What would you like to add?
No, I saw a question in the chat from Muthoni, which I think is a really wonderful question. So I kind of wanted to address that.
Perfect.
Yeah, and her question, I think the key question was that, given that we've been talking about the issue of incentives, and that there are powerful actors who invested billions in AI technologies. I think her question was, how do panelists see the democratization of AI technologies given these incentive structures? And yeah, and I think so. I have two kind of quick responses to that. One, which, and again, a really great question, I think. So one is that yeah, a lot of this does really come down to the development and ownership of AI systems. And I think part of this is really AI as a technology does depend on huge amounts of data, depends on some relatively kind of like advanced computing power, access to various kinds of resources. And all of this does, I think, weight AI as a technology in favor of large scale organizations as opposed to sort of smaller organizations. And I do think that is something that we should consider when in adopting AI or kind of moving towards AI. So I think there is a question here of, is it possible to, one, catalyze kind of more democratic funding systems that might sort of help kind of, for example, like work platform cooperatives, which are owned by kind of communities or workers on the one hand, or on the other hand, simply creating alternatives, because not everything, as we were sort of talking about, not everything needs to be channeled through AI. I think there are systems that we can think about that work very well that do not depend on AI systems, and that might sort of advance, kind of democratic ownership of systems that allocate resources.
Great.
I would also add on that theme of democratization of AI systems. There are huge avenues as well for open source AI systems where communities have access to learning platforms about AI systems, as well as data sets or models that they can then fine tune and change for themselves for their particular use. So there's a lot of different stakeholders within the machine learning environment. And so, of course, we hear always about the big ones, but there's also the smaller ones and even the big ones that provide open source models that can then be adapted by anyone who wishes to use them. And so it's out there. Clearly, there's a lot of work to be done in terms of democratizing it further. But the AI environment per se was also built upon a really open source philosophy as well. And there's a lot of open source, therefore, data sets or models, or even resources in general that anyone can use to further contribute to that particular environment, whether it's by creating it yourself or learning how to do it. It's out there as well.
Great, thank you. I'd love to come over with the same question. I think it's relevant to all four of you. So Andreas, Philip, how would you address this about the democratization of AI? Philip, maybe we'll come to you first, and then Andreas. We're wrapping up, so I'm going to ask you to continue to be brief so that we can fit everything in. But Philip, what are your perspectives on this?
No, the most brief, I think. I don't fall far from what Iman just shared.
All right, that was indeed brief. Thank you. Andreas, what would you like to add?
Yeah, I think the discussion goes exactly in the right direction. Maybe if I can add one point is that we talked about human dignity, and I think maybe we can have a bit of empathy with the system. It sounds vague, but I think like we saw in the comments in the chat, also a lot of people said, look, governments are more reacting instead of being strategic. And, some are more on the foresight angle and some maybe are not there yet. And potentially it's a fear of failure, right? And I think being okay to test and evaluate before more resources are invested or before the competitive pressures become too big, I think it's good to test out these multi-stakeholder partnerships that we mentioned for furthering digital public infrastructures. And that's involving public, private, and third sector actors. And so I think this way already helps a lot in making sure that AI systems can be democratized in the right way.
Fantastic. Then we're going to leave it there because, of course, things really get rolling as the end of the hour approaches. So first, I would like to thank all four of you, Parijat, Ima, Andreas, and Philip. Thank you so much for joining us today for this digital dialogue. Thank you to everyone who has joined us and also to those who will later watch on YouTube or listen to the podcast channel. Thank you so much to our international sign language interpreters and also our captioner who is doing all of that live. Amazing work. Thank you so much.